Here's the frame I want to set is, how many of you would say, if you think about it over the last 3 years, how many of you would say the demand in your life has significantly increased? How many agree? Okay, I'd be pretty surprised to be in a group like this if that wasn't the case. How many of you would say, given that the demand has increased as much as it has, and it probably was pretty high 3 years ago anyway, that when you look out over the next 3 years, you imagine that the demand is going to get still higher? How many agree? Okay. We don't have many imminent retirees here. So you've got a situation in which demand has been going up at a kind of inexorable way for the last several years. It's only going to get higher. So then here's the $64,000 question. If that's the case, how many of you believe that your capacity to meet that demand will rise right along with the demand? So that's why I'm here. We went from 100 agreements to 2. You might want to check out who those 2 were, because they know something we don't. It's not true unless you make an incredibly intentional effort to make that happen. Why? Why? Because it's about your capacity. Your capacity is the fuel in your tank. It's what makes it possible for you to bring your skill and your talent to life in the crucible of demand. And the reality is that capacity is not something that until very recently anybody has talked about very much. Why not? Because you had enough. Why would you talk about it? Why would you be focused on whether or not your car had gas if you knew that you just filled it up? So capacity, for the first time, is an issue because for the first time, demand in our lives is beginning to exceed it, to exceed the resources we have available to meet it. So what resource have we relied on until now when demand increased to get more things done? In other words, when you had to get more things done, historically, what did you invest more of? Time. Right, which is a great thing. You know, I mean, we all know that you're working longer hours than you ever worked before. If you're old enough to have had some work life 10 years ago, you know that, the explosion in technology, the sense that of its taking over our lives has only increased every single year. So that demand is incredibly high. Every time you need to expand it, not only do you work another hour, but you have your various digital devices and ways in which to stay connected all of the time. But there's a problem, nonetheless, that emerges with time, isn't there? What?
There's no more of it.
There's scarcity, there's no more of it, it's finite. In other words, there's 24 hours in a day, there's 168 hours in a week, and nothing's ever going to change that. That's it, that's all you've got. No congressional legislation is going to influence the number of that. No congressional legislation is going to influence anything, as you well know. But, separate category, I'll stay with this. So you need another resource. And what I want to do in these, I think I have, did you say I have 2.5 hours? In these 2.5 hours? What I want to do in these very few minutes I have is just give you a taste of what we at the Energy Project go out and do at organizations across the country and the world, which is to challenge the orthodoxy, to challenge the way we work, to really look at a counterintuitive way, what won't be counterintuitive, I don't think, in 10 years, but is still counterintuitive for a lot of people, and suggest 3 principles that anybody who is building an organization needs to be thinking about, in spite of the fact that each of the 3 is not the first thing, and in some cases is quite the opposite of what the instinct is to do in building an organization and building a culture. So the first one of those 3 is to build a culture that pulses. To build a culture that pulses. Now, for 200 years, we have lived in this country, and in fact in the industrialized world, we've lived by an ethic of more, bigger, faster is better. But the problem with more, bigger, faster is better, it's defined free market capitalism for all these years. The problem is that it works only so long as finite is, I combined 2 words there. It works only so long as resources are infinite. But when resources become finite, more, bigger, faster, for longer will eventually reach a crisis point. So if time is not a resource you can use, what can you use? And our answer is, given that we're named the Energy Project, energy. Energy is defined in physics as the capacity to do work. So the more energy you have, the more capacity you have. So if I can help you think about how do you build more sustainable capacity for yourself and for your organization, then that's a very high value thing for you to take away from this. So the first thing I said is build an organization that pulses. That's the opposite of more, bigger, faster is better. That's the linear expenditure of energy, and what I'm talking about is the rhythmic expenditure of energy. So the notion that it is not the number of hours you invest, nor that the people who work for you invest, that determine the value you create, but rather it's the energy you're capable of bringing to whatever hours you work. That's a fundamental paradigm shift, isn't it? Because what it suggests is that there might be value in something you have up to now probably considered to be a bad thing, namely renewal and recovery. So the idea which we first got 25 years ago working with professional athletes who were in trouble for one reason or another, not with the law, but with their performance, who were in trouble would come to us in the dark of night because it was, my partner was a psychologist and they didn't want it to be known that they were sissies, and they would show up, but they needed some kind of solution to their problem, and we would diagnose it as an energy management problem, as a problem in finding the right rhythm between the expenditure and the renewal of energy. Because what we know is that skillful renewal is a powerful fuel for sustainable high performance. In other words, renewal, which is ensuring that you will pulse, renewal is something that is fundamentally human. Humans are not designed to operate like computers, even though we often imitate our digital devices. In other words, like a computer operates at high speeds, continuously, for long periods of time, running multiple programs at the same time. Does that sound familiar? But a human being is meant to pulse rhythmically between spending and recovering energy in a very specific way. It turns out that we have inside us, not only are we governed by circadian rhythms of night and day that influence the need to sleep, which I'll come to in a moment, but we're also governed by an internal rhythm called the ultradian rhythm. That rhythm operates within us in 90-minute cycles, and every 90 minutes we move from a state, and this is where you were when you walked back into the room, of relatively high alertness and physiological arousal. And over the next 90 minutes, no matter what you do, in fact, especially if you are engaging in an absorbed way, you will slowly burn down that reservoir of energy, and you will hit a relative physiological low at the end of 90 minutes, meaning that you're not capable past 90 minutes of, over time, bringing the best of yourself to whatever it is you're doing. So in other words, the body at the end of 90 minutes of really focused work is screaming at you, what? Stop, give me a break, literally. But we override that rhythm. We override that rhythm with our stress hormones, unfortunately, with adrenaline and cortisol and noradrenaline, which is fine as an emergency source of energy. It's like a little one of those donut tires where you're so fine to use it to travel another 50 miles at 50 miles an hour. But if you keep using that source of energy for a long period of time, in the case of these stress hormones, for a long period of time in a very intense way, what it does is that energy source turns into a toxin. And it begins to break down the immune system, and it has a whole bunch of other emotional consequences, because cortisol and adrenaline and noradrenaline are associated with a wholly different way of physiologically fueling yourself, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So really this is what is so counterintuitive, is I'm suggesting to you, In a world in which I know, and I'm aware that this was part of the discussion this morning, I'm suggesting to you that more is not necessarily better. In fact, more explicitly is not better. That the downtime is actually productive time. That refueling is a critical aspect of your being able to perform at the highest level when you are performing. Think about how you now work. You come into work in the morning. Many of you come in very early. You work in a continuous way essentially all day long. So even when you might get up for a break, you probably have your cell phone in your hand and you're responding to email or you're texting. And now your energy is essentially going like this. It starts here at the highest level you're likely to have after you sleep. Whether you had enough sleep or not, that's the highest level you're going to be during that day. And then it progressively deteriorates or depletes as the day goes on. So you go from here all the way down to here. So if I'm right about this, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you have a lot less energy than you did at 11 o'clock in the morning. And at 7 o'clock at night, unless you are truly fueling yourself on excessive amounts of caffeine and sugar and your own stress hormones, fundamentally you're much more tired than you were in the morning. So therefore you're capable of bringing less to the table. What if you worked 10 or 11 hours, as you probably do at a minimum, many of you, most of you, 10 or 11 hours, but your average level of capacity relative to the possible was 40%, because you went from 80% in the beginning of the day to 60% as you moved through the day to 40% as you got to the late afternoon, down to 20% at the end of the day. So say your average level of energy was 40% or 60%, 50%, let's call it 50, it's an easy one, 50% all the way through the day. Now say that you came into work and instead what you did was you worked in a pulsing way. You worked at full intensity for 90-minute periods, but then you took a break. And so you took a 15-minute break at the end of the first 90 minutes, and at lunch, instead of eating at your desk or skipping lunch altogether, you actually left the building, you got some natural sunlight, you ate something healthy, you chilled out a little bit, you took 30 minutes. 30 minutes would be a miracle, wouldn't it, for lunch? You took 30 minutes, and then you took 2 more of those 15-minute breaks during the afternoon, and you actually worked an hour less because you decided that actually it would be better for me to have time to unwind at home and maybe be with my boyfriend or my girlfriend or my spouse or my children or whoever it is that's important to you. And instead of working at an average of 50%, because you went like this all day long, you didn't drop in the same way, and so the average level of energy started at 80%, but it never got below 60%. So you averaged 70%, you worked an hour and a half less, you do the math. And you're vastly more sustainable. I write books. I have a long history writing books. I was a journalist before I did this. I write books in 3 90-minute sprints in the morning, 7 to 8:30. Why in the morning? Because you have more energy in the morning and fewer distractions. I write them in 90-minute sprints with 15 to 30-minute segments between them. I now write those books twice as fast as I did when I worked all day writing them, and I have half the day left over. Why? Because I get more done in less time by having a higher level of intensity and a deeper renewal. Principle number 1. Second principle, build a culture that cares. Build a culture of caring. Now, this isn't totally counterintuitive. Unfortunately, it's not front and center in many organizations. A culture of caring. So let's go to why does that, in a measurable, concrete way, translate into better results? Here's the deal, emotionally. Look, we have a couple of core needs that we all know. You need to sleep, you need to eat, you need a warm, a roof over your head if you live in a certain kind of climate. But after that, the single most important thing in people's lives, across the board, everywhere, every culture, every age, every person, is to feel that you matter. It's to feel that you're valued and valuable. That's the new value equation. That's the new value proposition. That you need in your organization to begin to think of yourself as the chief energy officer. That's the number one, or I should say the most fundamental role that a CEO or a senior executive can play at an organization. So what does that mean, the chief energy officer? What it means is that your core job is to mobilize and focus and inspire and regularly recharge the energy of those you lead. If you do that, then what you've ensured is that you're getting the maximum amount from those people. How are you getting it? You're flipping the equation. Instead of asking for them to give more, instead of trying to get more out of them, you're investing more in them. You're figuring out across the 4 dimensions of energy what it takes to fully fuel the people who work for you. What are the 4 dimensions of energy? They're physical, that's the quantity of your energy. Emotional, that's the quality of your energy. Mental, that's the focus of your energy. And spiritual, that's the purpose to which you put your energy. If you've got all 4 of those nailed, if you've got the quantity, quality, focus, and purposefulness, you're ready to rock. But almost no one does because we're not intentional about it. And the core of this, as I was saying, in this second principle, is that emotionally, if you're not getting it right emotionally, it will knock out everything else. So what does right mean? Well, first of all, it turns out there's only one way. This is so interesting. There's only one way that people feel when they're performing at their best. Only one way. So the way is the way you feel when you're performing at your best. I know that sounds like it's a syllogism, but think about this. How do you feel when you're performing at your best? Tell me some words. Flow. Energized. Inspired. Focused. Grounded. Grateful. One more. Productive. Okay. So did you hear all those? Focused, engaged, energized, grateful, in the flow, grounded, and so on, right? Think of those for a moment. Now, in terms of the spectrum of from negative to positive, what do every one of those have in common where they fit on that spectrum? Positive, clearly. Now, on the spectrum from low to high, low quantity to high quantity, what do all those have in common? Where do they fit on that spectrum? High, energized, engaged, focused, and so on. So high positive emotions. I don't want to be Tony Robbins here, I'm not. But here's the reality of it is that high positive energy is what people feel when they're at their best. I've never had an executive or a person who I was talking to say to me, you know when I feel really fired up? It's when my boss comes into me and he's in a rage. That doesn't happen. So we need to feel high positive energy in order to bring the best of ourselves to work. Not just because it's what you feel when you perform at your best, but because if you don't feel that way, the odds are great that the way you most likely feel is high negative energy. Why do I say that? Because there are four potential ways you might be feeling. You might be feeling high positive, high negative, low negative, or low positive. Low negative is burnout. If you're feeling burnout at work for any sustained period of time, you're not going to be at work for very much longer, right? And if you're feeling low positive energy, you're carefree, kicked back, relaxed, mellow, you're probably not going to be at work for very long, right? That's not acceptable in the workplace. So by definition, if you're not in high positive energy, the likelihood is you've moved to high negative energy. High positive energy we call the performance zone. High negative energy we call the survival zone. Now here's what's interesting. People go to high negative energy only reactively. Nobody chooses it. It's the survival move. You go there when you experience a sense of threat. That's when you move to it. You've got a difficult deadline. You've got funding that fell through. You've got too many things on your plate. You've got somebody who isn't performing. Each of those are a threat that has the potential to move you into the high negative zone, which I'm calling the survival zone. What are the emotions associated with that? Fight or flight. anger, frustration, anxiety, fear. They represent a physiological response to the experience of threat that happens automatically. You move automatically or reactively from high positive to high negative when you feel a sense of threat. And what is the most fundamental threat? And when we have done this now with thousands of people and discovered that the core threat, the overwhelming threat that people are feeling when they're triggered, that's what we call it. When you're triggered, you know that experience, right? Think about the last time you were triggered, about the last time that you moved into negative emotion in a reactive way. And I'm going to tell you that if you trace it back, you're going to discover that what accounts for it is that you felt your value was under threat. So a chief energies officer's job is to help fuel every person's sense of value, of having value, and of being valuable within reason, because that's what's allowing that person to perform at the highest level most sustainably, most efficiently. Survival energy is also gas guzzling. When you feel anxious and upset or worried or frustrated, it burns down your energy. But also, when you're in fight or flight, you don't think as well. The prefrontal cortex naturally, automatically, I should say, shuts down. And so you can't think. How many of you have jobs in which you're required to think? So, building a culture of caring is a critical role. My company's 10 years old. For 8 years, I focused most of my energy as a CEO on the external world, on building a client base, on designing materials that we found would be effective, all that kind of stuff. I would say 90% of my energy went into one form or another of that. Today, 50% of my energy goes into taking care of our community, of building a community that takes care of each other, and making that a critical component of how we do business. And the wonderful thing for us is we can do that as a living laboratory, because that's what we're trying to figure out on behalf of our clients. So when we discover that it works, then we can bring it to our clients. So that's the second principle. The third and final principle is to build a culture of focus. That's easy, right? None of you are having any trouble with focus or distraction, are you? Right, I mean, so every time somebody here was sitting and tweeting something I said, they weren't listening to all the rest of what I said. While you're tweeting, you're not listening. You listen, you got something, and then you tweet. Meanwhile, you've missed the best thing that followed. Why? Because human beings cannot think of two things at the same time. But we pretend we can, which is why this is counterintuitive. We pretend we can. I think it's pretty much out there now as an understanding that multitasking is impossible, that it's neurologically not possible, and nonetheless, you're multitasking more than you ever have. And technology is a huge, huge factor. The Pavlovian pull of digital life is overwhelming. It's addictive. We can't kid ourselves. This is not, you have to say, you have to do a 12-step approach to this, which is, I realized my life had become unmanageable. Because it influences the same centers in the brain, the release of dopamine in particular, that it would if you were doing cocaine or any other recreational drug. Think of this as a recreational drug, these digital devices. And here's the thing, I'm not a Luddite. I completely understand that we need these devices. This technology is never going away. We have to learn to live with it, but we have to learn to manage it. We have to learn to manage it in a way that understands the pull that it has on us. You cannot say to yourself, I'm not going to answer email for the next 30 minutes while it's beeping. That's not possible. Each time that you hear that sound, the amount of will and discipline inside you necessary to resist that temptation is depleting. We do not have much will and discipline, and it gets very quickly depleted by each demand on it. And if you are depleting energy resisting at a given time, which most of you are not. You're not resisting your digital technology right now. But if you were to try to resist it, or if you have had periods where you tried to resist it, even 30 minutes where you tried to resist it, what's happening is that you're playing a losing game. And yet, what we need is focus. The most important, the most significant, the most valuable way to get good work done is to do one thing at a time in an absorbed way for a significant period of time. How does that feel? That's a friggin' bummer. Because it's hard, right? I mean, when's the last time that you fully focused on something, I mean really fully focused, for an hour? It's probably pretty unlikely that you do it very often. But all the good work that you do, all the meaningful work that you do, all the work that has long-term value, all the work that involves synthesizing and creating and imagining and pushing the ball forward, not operating within the box, not checking off things on your to-do list, taking on something strategic, something important that requires an absorbed kind of thinking. That needs your full attention. I just took a month off. I actually wrote about this. I have a column in the New York Times called Life at Work that I write once a week on Fridays. But I just wrote about taking a month off, during which for 2 weeks I actually shut down my technology. And I mean shut it down. How did I do it? I went to Amsterdam to visit my daughter and her husband, and I didn't bring my laptop. I didn't bring my phone. That's the only way. There is no other magic solution, trust me. If it's on, you will respond. So if you want to build a life that includes, not that replaces, if you want to build a life that includes the capacity to do deeply absorbed, reflective, imaginative thinking, and highly focused, task-oriented thinking, you must find times to turn off your digital life. As painful as that seems, and as impossible as that seems. And by the way, during those 2 weeks, I run a company, has 30 people in it. You would think I was putting the company at some risk by being completely inaccessible. Now, they did know how to reach me if they had to. How many calls did I get? 0. I got 0. Because when you empower people to solve problems by themselves, guess what? They do, unless the world is literally falling apart. So to build back your capacity for attention, to begin to be able to, you've been training, we get better at what we do most frequently. That's attributed to Aristotle wrongly. We are what we repeatedly do. It actually was said by Will Durant, but it doesn't matter, it's true. We are what we repeatedly do. So if you are constantly training yourself to move from a central focus of attention to whatever digital pull is coming in at you, you get better at at time shifting. You get better at it. But you never get as good as you would be if you focused on one thing at a time in an absorbed way continuously, period. So what you want to do, to finish this third principle, what you want to do is you want to learn to move the same way that you want to move between energy expenditure and energy recovery across a day. You want to move between two kinds of absorbed focus over the course of the day as many times as you can. Absorbed focus that I would call narrow absorbed focus, which is to say on your tasks, where you have a specific goal you're trying to accomplish, and it's linear, and it's left hemisphere, it's rational, it's deductive, it's logical, and it's what most of us do most of the time. You're much more efficient if you do that in an absorbed way. But you then want to move from that to what I would call wide or open attention, which is to say, to step back. So when you're looking at the laptop like this, you know, it looks like you literally can't get out of this room because there's no exit. Right? You're stuck in that box. But when you have the capacity to step back a little bit, when you actually change locations, when you put yourself out of what I would call transactional mode, then you have the opportunity to think in a more imaginative, big picture way. And that will not happen, that second one, if you don't create those times and spaces with a clear beginning and a clear end time because otherwise you will be drowned by the urgent. And you know what I'm talking about, don't you? So I wish I had more time, but I want to leave you with this image. I want to leave you with this image. And I will tell you that I love the idea, and I haven't done it much, but I love the idea of taking our company and working at your level, much more, meaning small startups, much more than it's more exciting to me because you're not so locked into what you do. And we are going to begin to offer opportunities for people to go through a longer experience of what I just introduced you to in a very, very small way. So I hope I find my way back to you and you find your way back to me. But let me leave you with this image. Right now, if you think about it, the likelihood is that you are living your life as if you were a marathoner. And in fact, you grew up and you probably had some ostensibly wise person say to you at some point in your life, hey, don't rush so much, it's a marathon. Conserve your energy, right? So that seems to make sense. Marathoner, I say you're a marathoner because it's a long race out ahead, there's no finish line in sight. And if you were to leave the start line of a marathon and go into a full-out sprint, what would happen? You'd run out of gas, you'd run out of capacity or gas very quickly. After 400 yards, you'd be through. So it sounds insane not to live your life as a marathoner. But the other thing that happens if you go out and run a marathon, as everybody who runs marathons successfully does, by conserving energy, is that by definition, you are never fully investing in what you're doing. You are carefully calibrating your energy as you go along. So you're never fully engaged in a marathon. You're as engaged as you think it's safe to be, knowing that it's a long race. I want to leave you with this suggestion. Is there any more room for this?
Somewhere, yeah. I'll make it.
I want to leave you with this suggestion, that you become a sprinter. That sounds insane. Sprint? It already feels like you sprint. Maybe it's technically a marathon, but don't you feel like you're sprinting from one thing to the next all day long? You're not. You couldn't be, because you'd be just like that marathoner. If you were literally sprinting, you'd drop like a stone after the second or third thing you did. So what does a sprinter do? A sprinter comes up to the line, looks down the track, 100 yards, 200 yards, 400 yards, and the sprinter says, can I fully engage in this activity? Can I give it everything I've got? And what does that sprinter say?
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. Yes, I can. Why?
Because he knows when it's over.
Because he knows when it's over. He sees the finish line. He sees the stopping point. He has a boundary. That's what we've lost. We've celebrated losing it. We've said, hey, that's great. The person who stays the latest is the smartest. The person who sleeps the least is the toughest. This is all friggin' insanity. It's wrong. It's wrong. What's right is when you're engaged, when you're in the game, you're fully in the game. And when you're stepping back and recovering, you're fully renewing. You stop living in the gray zone in between those, which gets you neither sustainability nor high performance nor a life. You take back your life because it belongs to you and it matters that you use it best. Thanks.